In the year 203, 5 young Christians were led out into the amphitheatre of the city of Carthage. 2 were freeborn men, 1 a male slave, and another a female slave called Felicity, who had given birth just 3 days ago. The 5th was a well-born, well-educated woman called Perpetua. She was a 22-year-old young mother. They had all recently converted to Christianity, and they were preparing for their baptisms when they were arrested, tried, and sent for execution. Around them, crowds were shouting and cheering as they were stripped and whipped, waiting to face off against a leopard, a bear, and a fierce cow.
This is the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicity, recorded in one of the few early eyewitness accounts of Christian executions that have survived. What makes this account so unique is that we don't just have the eyewitness accounts of their execution, but also Perpetua's own diary entries in the days running up to it, giving us an unprecedented look through the eyes of an early Christian martyr. In this episode, we explore the history of the first Christian martyrs.
Why were they willing to die? What did it actually mean to be a martyr? And why did early Christians believe that martyrs had special powers?
In Perpetua's own day, there was no empire-wide persecution. Instead, Christians experienced local and sporadic violence. Roman officials saw Christians' refusal to acknowledge the gods as particularly dangerous because they thought that this would anger the gods and would bring punishment on the empire itself. And so, Christians were sometimes denounced in court, and local governors sentenced them to execution.
Is that what happened to Perpetua?
Well, we don't know exactly how she was arrested, but quite possibly. But we do have an account of her trial. Perpetua and her companions were brought to court, and she was encouraged to renounce her faith and perform a sacrifice to the gods for the emperor. Even her father came to convince her not to throw her life away. When Perpetua refused, the court had her father beaten to try and get her to renounce. But she still refused to renounce her faith. She could not deny that she was a Christian. She said that just as you can't call a vase not a vase, neither can I call myself anything else than what I am, a Christian. For Perpetua, being Christian wasn't just a set of beliefs that she could get rid of. It was something she was in her whole self. To renounce her faith would be to renounce her own existence, and she just couldn't do that.
That's really inspiring. But what did the Romans make of it?
Well, Roman philosophers like Galen and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius were amazed at many ordinary Christians being so ready to accept death, but just didn't understand what they were dying for. Romans understood the idea of dying for a noble cause, a glorious death for your country or for your ideals, but that was only for philosophers or warriors. Christians from ordinary backgrounds just seemed to be throwing away their lives.
Yeah, I can understand why the Romans might think that.
A story of another martyr a few decades earlier might help us understand why the Christians were doing this. Polycarp was the leader of the church in Smyrna around the year 150 and may have met John the Evangelist.
As in the John?
Yeah, that one. Polycarp was in his 80s when he was executed in another amphitheatre in the city of Smyrna. And when he was asked to renounce Jesus, he said, "For 86 years I have been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me?" For Polycarp and many Christians, their loyalty was not just to a cause or a movement. It was more like a loyalty and a love for a person, Jesus, his king. And so Polycarp was sentenced to death and burnt. He was charged by the Romans for being the destroyer of the gods.
Did they mean the Roman gods?
Yeah. For many Christians, they even saw the opportunity to suffer for Jesus as a privilege. Jesus had said that people who were insulted and persecuted because of him would be blessed, and that those who lose their life will gain it. Martyrs saw themselves following in the footsteps of other characters in the Bible, like Stephen, who was the first to die for his faith in Jesus, as well as figures in Jewish history, like Daniel and his friends, who were courageous in the face of another empire, or the Maccabeans, who chose to die rather than deny God. The 3rd century theologian called Origen said that to suffer and die for Jesus was the greatest honor and gift you could give to God. It was the love of God that could help Christians suffer for him. He would go on to be tortured and die for his own faith.
Did every Christian think like this?
Well, for lots of Christians, it was just aspirational, and they gave in to Roman demands to sacrifice to the gods. But then there were others who went the other way, who volunteered to be killed. That was sometimes controversial.
How do you mean?
Well, there were some Christians who were voluntarily seeking out martyrdom. In fact, one of Perpetua's own companions, Satyrus, had given himself up as a Christian to be executed with them.
Oh, that's really courageous.
Yeah, it is, but sometimes it went a bit far. Some Christians were denouncing themselves and demanding to be martyred. There is even a story that one Christian jumped onto a fire to die with the other martyrs.
Oh, that doesn't seem right.
Yeah, many Christian leaders thought so too. There seemed to be a fine line between showing courageous solidarity with your fellow Christians, like Satyrus, and just being completely reckless with your life. So many leaders generally condemned actively seeking out martyrdom.
Okay, that makes sense. So what happened to Perpetua and her friends?
One of them was killed by a leopard. Perpetua and Felicity were trampled by a cow and then killed by a young gladiator, along with the others. Perpetua was the last to die, and the account says that when the gladiator stabbed her, she took his hand and placed it on her throat. This showed that she had chosen this fate, and that she wasn't afraid to die.
I can't even imagine what that was like. For early Christians, it wasn't only the brutality of the deaths that mattered, it was the meaning behind them. And Perpetua's diary entries really give us a glimpse into that. The night before she died, Perpetua records a dream that she had. In it, she faces up against a huge man, a wrestler that she has to fight and win against. She grapples with him, fights with everything she has, and defeats him and steps on his head. After this dream, she writes, "Then I awoke and understood that I was not to fight with beasts, but against the devil." Martyrs were described as athletes, and martyrdom was seen as a kind of trial or a contest to win a prize. This was already a very influential image in the New Testament, where Christians are described as people running in a race or as boxers fighting to win a prize.
Against who? The Roman Empire?
Not really. For Perpetua and early Christians, this contest was something happening on a spiritual level. They were not just demonstrating the strength of their faith to the people of Rome, but to spiritual beings behind the curtain of reality. Theologians like Tertullian, who was also from Carthage at around when Perpetua died, saw Roman prisons and arenas as the home of demons. And so when martyrs resisted the temptation to deny God and they chose to suffer and die, they were engaging in battle against the demons.
So they were thinking on a far bigger scale.
Yes, it wasn't just humans watching. God and the angels were cheering them on, and the demons were urging them to fail. The contest wasn't over until the martyrs were dead.
So they beat the demons by dying?
Yes, and we see this really clearly in the account of other martyrs in Lyon at a similar time. There was a slave woman called Blandina, who was killed by a bull alongside her owner, who Blandina had persuaded not to deny the faith. The account describes her as a mighty and invincible athlete who had overcome the adversary, that is, the devil. Origen similarly encouraged martyrs to persevere and slay the dragon.
But why? How does dying become winning?
Because that's kind of the entire story of the Christian faith. Christians believe that the death of Jesus on the cross, which seemed like a humiliating defeat, was actually the moment God won. And so when martyrs gave up their lives out of their love for God, they were understood to be imitating Jesus at his most victorious, his death. They were not victims, but victors. They were witnessing to their God. That, by the way, is the meaning of the word martyr, witness.
So when Christians saw and heard about the martyrs, they weren't just seeing the courage of people in their movement, they were seeing what the death of Jesus might have been like.
Exactly. They were witnessing the death of Jesus firsthand. Martyrs became tangible, living signs of Jesus in their day and age. In the face of the senselessness of death, martyrs, by dying like Jesus, showed everyone that there was a power stronger than death itself, the love of God.
So, by dying, they were proving that what they believed about Jesus was really worth everything.
Right. That's why martyrs were the first people commemorated as saints. From at least the 3rd century, Christians were visiting the graves of martyrs, including the graves of the apostles Peter and Paul, who were also martyred. Some Christians believed that martyrs had special powers before and after their death, to proclaim judgment, to pray, and to heal. They were bridges to the unseen world, and they were already with Jesus in heaven, sharing in his glory. Martyrdom accounts became a whole genre of books that grew very popular after a brutal period of empire-wide persecution under the Emperor Diocletian in the early 300s. Everyone was very clear that only Jesus should be worshipped. But they also thought that Christians should love and honor the martyrs for being imitators of Jesus at his crowning moment, his death on the cross.
Persecution in the Roman Empire ended with the Emperor Constantine, but it didn't end for all Christians. A period of brutal persecution was only just beginning in the Persian Sasanian Empire. And throughout history, Christian persecution never entirely went away. From China in the 9th century to the Middle East in the 14th century, we find Christians being persecuted by their rulers and their neighbours. In the 17th century, Christians were persecuted in Japan in ways that were very similar to Roman times. In the 20th century, millions of Christians were killed for their faith in communist gulags, concentration camps, by Islamic extremists and other regimes.
And then, on February 15th, 2015, on the African coast, not far from where Perpetua died, 21 Christians in orange jumpsuits were led out onto a beach. They had all refused to renounce their faith, and so after kneeling in the sand, they were all beheaded. Today, there are still those who are ready to kill others for not denying the name of Jesus. And still, there are those who are ready to die for him. And wherever they die, their stories strengthen the faith of Christians everywhere. And that's why Christians have said, for almost 2,000 years, that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Christian Story is a crowd-funded project where everything we make is made possible with the generous support of viewers like you. So if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, you can start giving on our website today. Every donation helps. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It would really help us out.